There's a house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood that people avoid, even in broad daylight. I was one of the few who lived near it, and I never thought much of it until one winter when everything changed. I had recently moved into the neighborhood, a small suburb where everyone kept to themselves. My neighbor, Mr. Harris, lived next door in that creepy house. He wasn't someone you'd see outside much, always closed curtains, always silence. His house stood out, not because it was old or run down, but because it seemed to consume any light around it. It had an aura of darkness, a subtle pressure in the air whenever you were near it. At first, I assumed it was just an overactive imagination, but soon, things started to get strange. It began one cold evening when I noticed Mr. Harris standing by his front door. He was staring at me through his window, his face pressed against the glass, not moving an inch. I didn't think much of it at first, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I'd never seen anyone stand so still for so long. He was always watching, always waiting. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, strange noises began to emanate from his house, groans, scratching sounds like something heavy moving. Sometimes I'd wake up at night to hear what sounded like muffled whispers from the walls of his house. I asked around, but no one seemed to know much about Mr. Harris. The few neighbors who had lived here long enough had only ever seen him in passing, but none ever interacted with him. One evening it was particularly cold, and I went to check my mail. As I stepped out onto my porch, I saw Mr. Harris standing at the edge of his driveway, a few feet away from my house, just staring at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his lips were cracked into a strange, unnerving smile. "Good evening, dear," he said in a voice that didn't quite match his age. It was raspy, like he hadn't used it in years. I nodded nervously, unsure of what to say, and quickly retreated inside. But the feeling of dread followed me, clinging to my skin. Something wasn't right. That night, the scratching sounds came again. But this time, they were louder, more frantic. I couldn't ignore it any longer. My curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the side of Mr. Harris's house, where the sounds seemed to originate. What I saw will haunt me forever. The window at the side of his house was cracked open, just enough for me to peer inside. In the dim light, I saw Mr. Harris, his back to me, hunched over, his arms raised above his head. And there on the floor was a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Her hands were tied behind her back. She was trembling. I froze, heart racing. The woman was trying to scream, but only muffled sobs escaped her. Mr. Harris was slowly, deliberately dragging something across the floor. I couldn't tell what it was, but the sound made my stomach turn. Then I heard the door behind me creak open. A chill ran down my spine. "Can I help you?" Mr. Harris's voice was soft, almost sweet. I spun around, nearly falling over in shock. There he was, standing behind me, just a few feet away. His expression was calm, but his eyes, there was something dark behind them. He was no longer the man I'd seen before. He had transformed into something else, something monstrous. Before I could react, he reached out and grabbed my arm. His grip was impossibly strong, and I could feel the coldness of his hand seep through my jacket. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to break free. "You shouldn't have seen that," he whispered, dragging me towards the house. In a panic, I kicked and screamed, finally managing to break free from his grasp. I ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding the frozen ground. I didn't stop until I was safely back inside my house, bolting the door behind me. I never spoke to Mr. Harris again, and I never saw the woman again either. But I still hear the scratching sounds at night sometimes, and every so often, I swear I see Mr. Harris standing in his window, staring at me, waiting.
Story number 2.
There's an apartment complex on the outskirts of town that people steer clear of, even though it looks like any other building at first glance. It wasn't until I moved into apartment 3B that I realized why everyone avoided it. The first few days went by without incident. The neighbors were quiet, and the building itself wasn't particularly memorable. However, there was one thing I couldn't shake: the heavy, unnatural silence that seemed to hang in the air. It was a place where even the sounds of traffic didn't penetrate, where voices didn't echo off the walls. At night, it felt as if the building itself was holding its breath. It started on a Wednesday night. I was in bed, reading, when I heard it, The sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from the hallway outside my door. At first, I thought it was just another resident, but when the footsteps stopped right outside my door, my blood ran cold. No knock, no announcement, just silence. I told myself it was nothing. I convinced myself it was just the building settling, but it didn't stop. Every night at exactly 2:13 a.m. the footsteps would return, always the same slow, deliberate pace. It was always at 2:13, never earlier, never later. And they always stopped right outside my door, as if someone was just standing there waiting. I thought about mentioning it to the building manager, but I hesitated. The tenants in the building were odd, and the few I had met didn't seem particularly friendly. The older woman across the hall never made eye contact, and the young man in 2A never answered when I knocked on his door to introduce myself. Something was off about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. One night, driven by curiosity and fear, I decided to confront whatever it was. At 2:13 a.m., I stood at my door, waiting. The footsteps started again, just as I had come to expect. My hand gripped the doorknob, but I hesitated. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Then, a voice, a low, raspy whisper came from the other side of the door. "I see you." A chill ran down my spine, and my heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded far too close. It felt like it was coming from inside my room, from the walls themselves. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I had no idea what to do. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but the line went dead as soon as I pressed the dial button. The building had never seemed so oppressive, so suffocating. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of nails scraping against wood from within my walls. The walls around me, which I had always assumed were just walls, felt alive, as though something was moving just beyond the surface, scraping, clawing, trying to get through. The noise was maddening, and it didn't stop. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the apartment, running down the dark hallway. When I reached the stairs, I saw something that made my stomach churn. A shadow, tall and thin, lurking at the bottom of the stairwell, just out of reach of the dim light. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and calculating. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to leave. As I ran down the stairs and out of the building, I heard the footsteps behind me again, echoing down the hallway. But I didn't look back. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. The apartment remained on the market for months. No one ever stayed there for long. I tried to get in touch with the manager to ask about the strange events, but the number was disconnected. A few weeks later, I passed by the building and noticed something strange. The windows on the top floor were boarded up. There was no sign of life, no movement. But as I walked past, I swear I saw a figure watching me from one of those windows, its pale face pressed against the wood. I don't know who or what was in that building, but I'm certain it's still there, waiting for the next tenant to come and discover what lies beneath its silent facade.
Story number 3.
I used to love driving at night. The peace, the quiet, the road stretching endlessly ahead. It was the perfect way to clear my head after a stressful day. But that was before I encountered her. I was on a late-night drive, heading home after a long shift. The route I took was isolated, winding through a dense forest with only the occasional sign of life. An old, abandoned farmhouse here and there, the occasional flicker of a distant light from a cabin. There was no traffic, no one else on the road, just me and the hum of my car's engine. Then I saw her. At first, I thought she was just a hitchhiker, standing by the side of the road with her thumb out. It wasn't unusual to see someone stranded out here. This stretch of road was notorious for being dangerous, and it wasn't uncommon for people to need a ride. But as I got closer, I felt a strange unease in my stomach. She wasn't just standing by the side of the road. She was waiting. Her clothes were tattered, dirty, as if she'd been standing there for days. Her hair was wild, tangled, and unkempt, obscuring part of her face. She was staring directly at me, not waving, not asking for help, just staring. The moonlight highlighted the sharpness of her features, her pale skin, and those eyes, so dark they looked like endless voids. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. Should I stop and offer her a ride? My instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. Something was wrong. As I passed her, she moved, just slightly, her head tilting to one side, her eyes never leaving mine. Then she took one slow, deliberate step into the road. I slammed my foot on the brake, my heart racing. I could feel the blood drain from my face. My headlights illuminated her, and I saw her more clearly now. Her face was gaunt, her features sunken, like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Her lips were cracked, and her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Before I could react, she took another step forward, still staring at me, her eyes now wide with an expression of pure desperation. She raised a hand, palm open, as though she was begging for something, begging for help, or maybe for me to stop. I didn't think, I just drove. I floored the accelerator, speeding past her as fast as I could. My rearview mirror showed her figure shrinking in the distance, but I could still feel her presence behind me, lingering. The next few miles were a blur, my mind racing, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting her to be right behind me, but nothing. The road was empty. Finally, I reached a small town and pulled into a gas station. I was shaking, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I got out of the car, trying to calm myself down. The attendant, an older man with a grizzled face, looked at me curiously. "You okay, kid?" he asked, noticing the look on my face. I didn't know how to explain it, so I just nodded. "I think I saw something on the road," I said quietly. A woman standing in the middle of nowhere. It was like she wanted something. The attendant's face went pale. He glanced nervously out the window, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "That road, it's not safe," he said. "You don't want to stop for anyone out there, especially at night. Some folks say there's a woman who haunts that stretch. They say she died in a car accident, waiting for someone to help her. Some drivers stop, but most never make it home." I froze, a cold shiver crawling down my spine. I didn't need to hear more. The attendant continued, "But the ones who do come back, they say it's like she's inside their car now, following them. They'll hear her breathing, feel her presence, and sometimes they'll see her reflection in the window, right next to them. She never speaks, she just stares." I didn't sleep that night. The image of her face, pale and gaunt, those dark eyes, kept flashing in my mind. And every time I closed my eyes, I thought I could hear her, breathing behind me. To this day, I can't drive down that road anymore. I still remember that look on her face, desperation mixed with something darker, something that felt like it was waiting for me. I don't know if she's still out there, but I hope I never find out.
Story number 4.
It was a summer evening when my cousin invited me to spend the weekend at their family's remote cabin in the woods. The cabin was tucked away in a thick forest miles from the nearest town, a place where no one could hear you scream, literally. We were used to it. Their family had always gone to this cabin for years, but something felt different this time. As the sun set and darkness crept across the sky, the mood inside the cabin shifted. I noticed my cousin's parents were acting strangely, whispering amongst themselves in hushed tones whenever I was near. "Don't go wandering too far off the property," my cousin's mom said, her voice tight, her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for something. I laughed it off, thinking she was just being overprotective. But something in her expression made me pause. It was like she was afraid of something out there in the woods, something she didn't want to say aloud. That night, after a dinner of grilled meats and campfire stories, I decided to take a walk under the stars, wanting to stretch my legs before bed. My cousin warned me not to go too far, but I didn't listen. The air was cool, and the trees above made strange creaking sounds as the wind rustled through the branches. I wandered deeper into the woods, the sounds of the cabin fading behind me. It was eerily quiet, the only noise being the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I had no flashlight with me, so the dim light from the stars was the only guide. That's when I saw it, a flickering light in the distance, moving steadily through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a campfire or someone else in the woods, but as I got closer, I realized it was too erratic. The light bobbed up and down, moving in unnatural ways. I felt a strange pull towards it, like it was calling me, drawing me in. I followed the light, my heart racing with a mix of curiosity and unease. The air felt thick around me, as if I was walking through something that shouldn't exist. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisting and gnarled. And then I heard it, a soft, whispering voice, faint but clear. "Come closer." I froze. My mind screamed at me to turn around and run, but my legs felt heavy, with my body rooted to the spot. I strained my eyes to see what was ahead, the flickering light getting brighter, more erratic. Suddenly, I saw it, a figure. It was barely visible at first, blending in with the darkness. But as I stepped closer, I realized it was a person, or at least it looked like a person. The figure stood motionless, its back to me, the light coming from an old lantern they held in one hand. I called out, but no answer came. My voice barely broke the silence. I took another step closer. The figure remained still. Then a hand shot up from the figure's side, pointing directly at me. "Don't go any further," the voice whispered. But it wasn't a voice from the figure. It was coming from all around me, echoing in the woods. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. The trees seemed to shift, their branches twisting and reaching out, blocking my path. I managed to break free, running back towards the cabin as fast as I could, the sound of whispering voices chasing me through the woods. By the time I reached the clearing, I was gasping for air, my legs weak, my entire body trembling. When I returned to the cabin, my cousin's parents were waiting for me, their faces pale and drawn. "You shouldn't have gone into the woods after dark," my cousin's dad said, his voice low. "The woods aren't what they seem. We've told you to stay close for a reason." I was too shaken to respond. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustling of leaves outside, made my skin crawl. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and told my cousin I was leaving early. But as I was walking to the car, I glanced at the trees one last time. And there, standing in the distance, was that figure again, still holding the lantern, its pale face illuminated in the dim light. I never went back to that cabin again. Years later, I found out the truth. The woods were cursed. People had gone missing there over the years, vanishing without a trace. Locals said the spirits of those who wandered too far had been trapped by something ancient, something in the forest that took their souls. The figure with the lantern was one of them, a warning to anyone who dared to enter. Now, every time I see a lantern in the distance, I feel that same sense of dread. I'll never forget the whispering voice. It's a warning that still haunts me. Don't go any further.
Story number 5.
I had always loved going to thrift stores. There was something about the old, forgotten items that intrigued me, their stories, the lives they had once lived. One afternoon, I visited a small thrift store I'd never been to before, tucked in a corner of the city's older district. It was a cozy little shop with narrow aisles and shelves stacked high with vintage knickknacks, old books, and dusty furniture. The place smelled of mothballs and nostalgia. I was browsing through some old records when something caught my eye. A small, ornate mirror, framed in dark wood with intricate carvings that seemed almost too detailed for something so small. It was tucked behind a stack of old picture frames, almost hidden from view. The glass was cloudy and scratched, but there was something about it that drew me in. It felt different, almost alive, if I could put it into words. I picked it up, and the moment my fingers brushed the frame, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The shopkeeper, a thin man with a kind smile, noticed me holding it and approached. "Ah, that one," he said softly. "It's been here a while. Strange thing, that mirror. You sure you want it?" I hesitated, looking at him. "What do you mean, strange?" The man smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Some say it's cursed, been passed around for generations, always finding its way back to the shop. But if you're interested, it's yours for a fair price." I laughed it off, thinking it was just one of those oddities people tell stories about to make their items seem more interesting. After a brief pause, I decided to buy it. The price was low enough that I figured I could add it to my collection of odd things without much thought. That night, after I got home, I hung the mirror on my wall. The reflections it cast were strange. The room looked different through its surface, darker, more distorted. I brushed it off as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It started the first night. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft, whispering voices. I thought it was just the wind or my neighbors, but the voices seemed to be coming from the direction of the mirror. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the floor, and walked over to it. The whispers stopped as soon as I stood before it. The next day, I noticed something odd. My reflection was slightly different than it used to be. I could see myself standing in the room, but behind me, in the reflection, something wasn't right. The light in the mirror was dimmer, as if the room was clouded by fog. And there was something standing behind me, something I couldn't quite make out, its form too blurry, like it was shrouded in darkness. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But every night the whispers grew louder. Every time I looked into the mirror, the dark figure behind me seemed to grow clearer, more defined, until I could almost make out its face. It was a grotesque mask of twisted features, unnaturally large eyes, a gaping mouth frozen in a silent scream, and a sharp, bony hand reaching toward me. I couldn't stop staring at the mirror. I couldn't look away. Every night, I'd find myself standing before it, mesmerized by the dark figure behind me, drawn to its presence. It felt like it was calling to me, urging me to come closer. One evening, I finally reached out to touch the glass. The moment my fingers made contact, everything went cold. The room around me seemed to warp, the edges of my vision blurring. For a brief moment, the reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It was the dark figure, now standing right in front of me, its hand reaching toward the glass, as if trying to pull me in. I snapped back, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I realized then that I wasn't just looking into a mirror. I was looking into another world, a place that was pulling at me, drawing me in with every passing second. I ran to the phone, desperate to call for help, but as I turned away from the mirror, I heard a soft, mocking laugh. It came from behind me. I whirled around, but the reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It was the dark figure, its eyes now wide open, staring directly at me, unblinking. "You wanted me." I slammed the mirror face down on the floor, my heart racing. I knew I had to get rid of it, but it was too late. The room felt different now, heavier, like the air was thick with something suffocating. The laughter had stopped, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just behind me. I decided to take the mirror back to the thrift store the next day. But when I arrived, the shopkeeper was gone. The shop was empty, its doors locked, the windows covered in dust. There was no sign that anyone had been there in years. I went back home, leaving the mirror in my car, hoping it would somehow disappear, but I knew it wouldn't. And that night, when I looked at my reflection, I realized that the figure was no longer in the mirror. It was behind me, standing in my room. I can still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, coming from the mirror, still waiting for me to come back to it.
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. My friends and I rented a cabin up in the mountains, far from the city lights and noise. We were looking forward to a few days of hiking, bonfires, and maybe a little bit of stargazing. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The cabin was beautiful, large, rustic, with an old-world charm. It had everything we needed, and the surrounding forest was peaceful, thick with trees and silence. But the air was heavy, and the trees themselves seemed unnaturally still. The ground felt almost too soft underfoot, like the earth was too willing to swallow you. The first night was uneventful. We spent hours sitting around the fire, drinking and telling stories. But the second night, things started to go wrong. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the cabin door. It was faint at first, a soft scraping noise, like something with long nails dragging across wood. I sat up in bed, listening, trying to determine if I was just imagining it, but it wasn't my imagination. The scratching continued, then stopped. Then it started again, a little louder this time, a little more frantic. I got up quietly and crept over to the window to look outside. But the forest was as still as ever. No movement, no creatures. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been a tree branch scraping against the door in the wind. I went back to bed, though the unease lingered in my chest. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends, but they all brushed it off, laughing about how it was probably just an animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, we all went to bed early, exhausted from a day of hiking. But I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things outside, muffled footsteps, distant calls, like someone was walking around the cabin, just out of sight. It felt like someone or something was out there, waiting. I decided to investigate. Quietly, I slipped on my shoes and grabbed a flashlight. I stepped outside, heart pounding, my breath coming in short bursts as I scanned the dark woods. The trees were thick, the moon barely visible behind the clouds, but I thought I saw something moving at the edge of the forest, just a shadow blending into the darkness. I called out, but there was no answer, just the silence of the woods. And then I heard it, a whisper. "Come closer." I froze. It was coming from the edge of the woods, right where I had seen the shadow move. My stomach twisted in knots, and I slowly turned back toward the cabin. But when I looked over my shoulder, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing just inside the tree line, staring at me. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a silhouette too tall and too thin to be human, with elongated limbs and a head that was too large. It was watching me, unmoving, its shape barely distinguishable in the dark. My feet were rooted to the ground, and I couldn't move. The whisper came again. "Come closer." I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted toward the cabin, adrenaline flooding my veins. I slammed the door behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. When I returned to the others, I was out of breath. "There's something out there," I said, my voice trembling. But my friends just laughed. "You're just spooked from the hike," one of them said. "It's probably just a bear or something." I didn't believe them, though, not after what I'd seen. The night passed uneventfully, but the next morning, I noticed something chilling. The door to the cabin had been scratched, deep gouges like something had tried to claw its way inside. The marks were fresh, still jagged and raw. I showed my friends, but they just shrugged it off, insisting it was probably an animal. That afternoon, I decided to go home early. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with that feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the woods. But as I was packing my things, I heard the scratching again. This time, it was inside the cabin. It started at the door and then moved to the walls, slow, deliberate, like something was trying to carve its way through. I didn't look. I didn't want to. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the cabin, heading straight for my car. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, dark and silent. But I swear, just before I turned the corner, I saw the same figure standing at the window, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, watching. I never went back to that cabin, and I never told anyone what happened that night. Not in full. It's been years, but I can still hear the whisper every time I'm alone in the dark. "Come closer."
Story number 7.
It was the kind of place you'd only go to if you had no other choice. The Sparrow Creek Motel was run down and barely advertised, located just off an old highway in the middle of nowhere. I'd been driving for hours, the road ahead a long stretch of asphalt bordered by nothing but dense woods. I was tired, too tired to keep driving, and the sign for the motel flickered dimly in the distance. I pulled in, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, peeling paint, broken windows, the kind of place you'd expect to see in horror movies. But it was late. I needed a place to rest, and there was nowhere else for miles. I walked to the front desk, where an older man with a gray beard sat behind a counter, his eyes dull and lifeless. "You're the only guest tonight," he said with a dry rasp, hardly looking up. He handed me a key to room 3, which was the farthest one down the hall. I didn't think much of it, just nodded and headed to the room. It smelled musty, like mildew and stale air. The bed was unmade, the sheets thin, and the wallpaper was stained with something I didn't want to examine too closely. But I didn't care. I was exhausted. The moment I lay down, I heard something. A soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere outside the room. It was faint at first, almost like a tapping on the wall, but it was steady, persistent. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes, hoping it would fade. But it didn't. The tapping grew louder, and now it seemed to be coming from the floorboards beneath the bed. I got up, my heart racing. The room was empty, and the sound stopped the second I stepped out of bed. I checked the window, no one was there. The sound didn't make sense, but I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably the old building settling or the wind. I lay back down, trying to relax. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it was more frantic, like something was scratching at the floorboards, trying to get through. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in my bag and slowly turned it toward the corner of the room. The light flickered once, twice, and then settled on the floor. My eyes widened when I saw something move, something under the floorboards, shifting slowly. The boards creaked and the scratching grew louder. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a pair of hands, pale, bony fingers, slide through the crack between the floorboards. They were reaching toward me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The hands seemed to be trying to pull themselves out from under the floor, moving with an unnatural slowness, like they were struggling to escape something. In a panic, I grabbed my things and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced as I hurried back to the front desk. The old man was still there, staring at me with those dull eyes. "I need to leave," I said, my voice frantic. "There's something in the room, something under the floor." The man didn't blink. He didn't move. He just stared at me with that same lifeless gaze. "You don't want to do that," he said in a low, calm voice. "Once they're awake, they don't let you go." I froze. My breath hitched, and I felt a chill spread through me. The man stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "They only come out when someone stays in that room," he said. "They've been down there for decades, waiting for someone to check in. But once they're awake, they'll follow you. You'll never be free." I turned to run, but the hallway suddenly seemed longer, darker, as if the walls were closing in around me. I sprinted toward the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the handle. When I finally burst through the front door and into the night air, I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. I drove as fast as I could, my car speeding down the dark highway, and I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town hours later. I haven't spoken a word about what happened since that night, but every time I pass by an old rundown motel, I feel a cold shiver crawl up my spine, and I can't help but wonder if I ever really escaped. The scratching, I'm sure, is still there, waiting.
Story number 8.
It was the first time I had ever traveled to the small town of Ashfield. I had heard about it from a friend who swore by the peacefulness of the place, claiming it was the perfect spot to get away from the chaos of the city. So, when I decided to take a solo trip for some peace and quiet, I thought it would be a great idea to visit. Ashfield was quiet, almost too quiet. The streets were lined with old brick houses, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of wooden floorboards and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt like stepping back in time, as if nothing had changed in the town for decades. The inn I booked a room at was an old Victorian-style building, a bit worn down but charming in its own way. I checked in, unpacked, and spent the evening walking around the town. There was a strange unease in the air. The townspeople seemed to keep to themselves, casting glances that lingered just a little too long, their faces unreadable. At first, I chalked it up to the small-town mentality, where everyone knew everyone, and outsiders were often treated with suspicion. But something didn't feel quite right. That night, as I returned to the inn, I noticed an old woman sitting on a rocking chair on the front porch, staring out into the darkened street. She looked like she had been there for hours, unmoving, her gaze fixed on something far away. I gave a small wave as I passed, but she didn't respond. I thought nothing of it at the time, but when I opened the door to my room, something immediately felt off. The room was colder than it should have been, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in ages. As I unpacked my things, I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the closet. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but then the knocking grew louder, more persistent. I hesitated, wondering if I should investigate, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in my chest. But curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly walked toward the closet. I placed my hand on the door handle, the wood cold to the touch. With a deep breath, I opened it. There was nothing inside the closet, just the usual clothes rack and a small wooden shelf. But then, something caught my eye. On the floor, beneath the bottom shelf, was a small wooden box. It was old, covered in dust, and it had strange markings carved into the surface. The moment I touched it, a sharp chill ran through my body, like electricity coursing through my veins. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to open it. Inside, there was a piece of paper, a faded yellowed note with a strange symbol drawn on it. It looked like some sort of warning, but the writing was in a language I couldn't recognize. I decided to leave it there, hoping I hadn't disturbed something that was meant to stay hidden. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and every creak of the floorboard sent my heart racing. At around 2 a.m., I heard a soft whisper, so faint that I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, as if it was coming from right behind me. "Leave this place." I bolted upright in bed, but the room was empty. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, and I got up to check the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside. But there was nothing. I tried to calm myself and went back to bed, but the whispers continued. Over time, they grew louder and more distinct. "Leave. Leave now. They're coming." The words were like an eerie chant surrounding me, suffocating me. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to pack my things and ran down the stairs, only to be met with the old woman sitting on the rocking chair again. She was still staring down the street, but this time she slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were wide, too wide, with a coldness that sent a wave of terror through me. "You shouldn't have stayed." Her voice was quiet but firm. "You've heard the whispers, haven't you? They're coming for you." I didn't ask her what she meant. I just ran. I ran out of the inn, past the silent, watching townsfolk, and I didn't stop until I was out of Ashfield. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The town was still there, dark and quiet, but I could swear I saw figures standing at every window, watching me leave. I never went back to Ashfield, and to this day, I have no idea what the town's dark secret was, or what I had awakened when I opened that box. But every time I think about it, I still hear the whispers in the back of my mind. "Leave this place, they're coming."
Story number 9.
I've never been one to believe in supernatural stories, but that all changed after I moved into the old house on Crescent Street. It was a charming Victorian-style home with tall, narrow windows and a sweeping front porch. The price was right, and the neighborhood seemed quiet, perfect for starting fresh after a difficult breakup. The realtor mentioned that the house had been empty for a few years, and there were some small repairs needed here and there, but nothing I couldn't handle. I didn't give it a second thought, assuming she was just being overly cautious. The first few days in the house were uneventful. The creaks of the old floorboards and the drafty windows were just the usual signs of an aging house. But then, on the fourth night, things started to get strange. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm myself down. That's when I heard it, a soft, faint whispering from the hallway. At first, I thought it was the wind or some noise from the house settling, but the whispers grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but they were distinct, as if someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, talking in low, urgent tones. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the floor, and tiptoed toward the door. As I crept into the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the attic was wide open. I had made sure to lock it when I moved in, but now it was ajar, as if someone or something had been in there. My mind raced, but my body moved before I could think clearly. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and went up to the attic. The air was thick, musty, and smelled like old wood and dust. As I shone the light around, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. But then, in the far corner, something caught my eye. A large, ornate mirror that I didn't recognize. The mirror was framed in dark wood, intricate carvings lining the edges. The glass was cracked, and it seemed out of place in the otherwise empty attic. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out almost instinctively. As I touched the frame, I felt a sharp jolt of electricity, a strange surge of energy that made my skin tingle. That's when the whispering stopped. For a brief moment, everything was silent. But then, as if waking from a long slumber, the mirror began to glow faintly, a sickly green light pulsing from its surface. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't my own. It was a pale, hollow-eyed version of me, standing just a few inches away, her face twisted in a grotesque, hollow grin. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my heart racing. The reflection in the mirror began to move independently, its hand reaching out toward me, the fingers scraping against the glass in slow, deliberate motions. I ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me, and locked it. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. The whispers and the eerie glow from the attic mirror haunted me until morning. The next day, I went out to clear my head, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The house was silent, but it felt wrong, like something was lurking just beneath the surface. I tried to ignore it, hoping I was just letting my imagination run wild. But when I returned later that evening, things had gotten worse. The attic door was wide open again. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at it, my stomach twisted in knots. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and headed straight upstairs. But when I reached the attic, I found something I hadn't expected. The mirror was gone. In its place, on the floor, was a small pile of old photographs, dozens of them scattered across the dusty wooden floor. They were all of the house, but there was something unsettling about them. Each photo had a figure standing in the background, someone I didn't recognize, their face obscured by shadows. But in every photo, they were standing in the same spot, just outside the frame. And in the final photograph, they weren't in the background anymore. They were right next to me. I turned to look behind me, but the attic was empty. Still, I felt something, or someone there, right behind me. And that's when I realized the truth. I wasn't alone in that house. Whatever was in that mirror, whatever had been whispering in the night, had been waiting for me to find it. And now that I had, it wasn't going to let me leave.